Hello everyone! Thank you for joining me for another book review. Today I will be reviewing Sex Matters, From Sex to Superconsciousness by Osho, the great mystic of all time. Some of you might be familiar with him. I've definitely listened to many of his talks, and I do have a couple more of his books. One about creativity and the other one is about insight. But this is the first time I read this book. I found it at a bookstore about a month ago, but I got sidetracked with other books, so now I'm glad that I'm actually returning to it. So before I start, I actually want to say a few things about my interest in sexuality itself. And those of you who know me probably know this already, that I have this interest in sexuality. But I also am writing a book currently about sexuality, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel, so I'm taking my time just to see what's out there, what has been written, and I will hopefully finish it soon and share it with everyone. I'm not in a hurry though, so it might take a while. So the reasons are twofold for my interest. The one is that I come from a very repressive culture. Like many of us. So this, and the other reason is that I have a passion for creativity, and I know throughout my research that creative energy is sexual energy. So these two things combined together are what have driven me to write this book. As for the book by Osho, he talks about a lot of things, and I will not go into everything that he discusses. He talks about marriage and children, and about same-sex relationships and society and how it's sick, and about Freud and his limited view of sexuality, and he talks about morality and that it must not be associated with sexuality. That basically morality is more about truth and sincerity and compassion and these things. So part one, he divides the book actually into two parts. In part one, he tells us what the problem is, and in part two, he gives us the solution to this problem. So part one is basically that society represses sexuality, and it programs its children to think of it as a sin, and this creates a lot of problems. So he says that sexual energy is actually love energy that still requires to be transformed. So basically taking it to a higher level. And we must understand that humanity cannot exist without sex. Obviously, it is the energy of the entire creation. So that's also part of the sexual energy as creative energy. So this whole universe wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this energy. This is why we must not shun it, because sex is something that we need to build a friendship with. And then he says that sex can be a way to enlightenment if we give it the chance. He says sex helps us bring about feelings of egolessness and timelessness. And these are important elements of a spiritual and religious experience. So when we crave for sex, we are in reality craving for egolessness and timelessness, as well as the experience of samadhi, which is the union with the divine. And once we understand this, he says, we are able to transcend sex. So we cannot have this understanding if we suppress it, because we're hiding away from it or not bringing it to our attention. We are not discovering the reality of it. So to be free, one must have such an experience also outside of a sexual context. So it starts out as having this experience within a sexual context, but then one must evolve into having this experience outside of this sexual context. We can transcend sex, but only if we do not repress it first. So basically, it's gradual. He advises not to jump into celibacy when you're 16. Actually, embrace your sexuality, and just as long as you're not harming anyone and you're not being aggressive or violent or hurting people, then it's a teaching tool. So he also says that we lose energy by having sex, which is one of the things that I studied in Ayurveda. And it is a risk when we are usually willing to take just for those few moments to reach superconsciousness or samadhi, divine union. And he reassures us there is another way that we can do this and not lose this energy, and this way is through meditation, he says. Osho is very, very self-negatory sometimes, so he'll say something and then negate it later. You'll see what I mean. So then he says we become fully human once we transcend sex and instead use meditation to reach superconsciousness. He continues to write that to free children from repression, we must teach them meditation and we must teach them love. But we also must teach them that sex is not a sin. So we have a lot of work on our hands. That's why I was urging all new parents to read this book yesterday. And not necessarily to take everything he says, but there are some gems in there. Then he tells us that sexual energy is of 3 levels. So there's the physical, where sex is for sex's sake, like when someone has sex with a prostitute or when someone with someone that they don't know or do not have any feelings for. And then there's the psychological sex, which is, or psychological energy, which is when couples who are in love are actually having sex. And the third one is spiritual. This level is, he says, does not exist anywhere. But then he goes on to say that actually this is unconditional love, like the mother for her child. So he says this is the true meaning of love. So yeah, he just keeps negating himself here and there. Then part 2, so that was the problem. Then his solution is that Tantra is the answer. And it is the answer to raise sex into a spiritual world dimension, because it teaches that sex can be a meditation. He advises to become a witness in everything you do, including sex. So this is basically what Tantra is also. Let your life become a meditation. Remain conscious, and you can transform this sexual energy into meditative energy. And this is actually the way the transformation happens. And this is how we have sages and mystics and seers. It's because they were able to transform this sexual energy into meditative energy. And that is the goal, to learn and understand this energy and then transcend it. So he goes into the meaning of desire as well, which is really interesting. He says desire means that we are discontent with life. So that's where our desires come from. So when we're desiring something, it means we want to change what's happening around us. We don't like this house, we desire a new house. We don't like this car, we desire a new car. So to be desireless means accepting every moment as it is. And this is what helps us transcend. Yeah, it takes a while to get there. I know. And then he talks about marriage. And he says that marriage is not necessarily about love or the romantic concept of love, but it is about going deeper into intimacy, communion, and doing something together that one cannot do on their own. It is about deepening the togetherness and the friendship. And he says marriage is a spiritual communion and a training ground for egolessness. So if you have a big ego, marriage is not for you. So with such a marriage, we are able to give birth to kind souls, or different kinds of beings than what humanity has been giving birth to so far. So this is part of his superconsciousness thing. So basically, a short summary of this book is that we need to do something about sex education and the way we are programmed to repress it. Not just in this country, but all over the world. That is, if we wish to evolve as a species, he says. The answer is in Tantra and in meditation. And really, Tantra is not the misunderstood ideas about Tantra, because that's what we perceive about Tantra, is that it's just about sexuality. But actually, it is about elevating sexuality into the sacred realm, into the spiritual level. So transcending the levels that he spoke about, the physical, the psychological, and then finally getting to the spiritual. So he also says something about that sex moves from being sexual into love, and then finally it becomes prayer. So once it reaches into the spiritual realm, sex becomes a prayer to the divine. So he also advises to start, before having that intimate moment, to start with a prayer or to end with a prayer, which I thought was really beautiful. So I like Osho. He is one of my favorite mystics. But I found this book very repetitive. It could have been half the pages and he could have still gotten the message across. And if you're familiar with Osho's talks, you know what I'm saying here. He tends to repeat stuff a lot, which is probably helpful for some people. So I'm not saying that he needs to do anything different. I'm just giving my opinion here. And then I also found that his ideas on polygamy were a bit challenging for me personally. Some people might completely embrace them very easily. And I suppose I was trying to interpret them in a way I felt more comfortable with them. But I truly believe that that is also a part of his message. And that is, it is a growth. You grow from wanting to be with many or multiple partners into wanting to go deeper in intimacy with just one person. And that is why people get married. I hope, at least. And then one last thing I found interesting in the book is he mentions Brahmacharya, which is the right use of energy, and it's one of the yamas of Hatha Yoga. He says that this is a way to suppress sexuality. But I also think he forgot that he had said it is a growth. So the sage who has grown through and past sexuality will not really be bothered by the right use of energy. So it would just come to him naturally, like he would not have to worry about the fact that he's suppressing it. So once you reach a certain level, then it's not a big deal. I think he's just saying that to be mindful of these stages and try not to push oneself or others into things that they cannot handle right away. He's quite the rebel. Anyhow, this is it for today's book review. I'm thinking, well, I'm not thinking, I'm pretty sure the next book review is going to be J.P. Sears' Ultra Spiritual. So stay tuned for that one. I'm looking forward to review it. I haven't read it. I'm glad I bought it. So I'll be reading it in the next week or so. Take care. Until next time. Bye-bye.